Well, thanks very much. Thanks to Colin for a nice lunch, and to Kimberly Ducey for inviting me here. It's really great to come to Winnipeg and catch up. Kimberly has been doing such great, interesting work in liberation sociology. It's great to know what she's up to here at University of Winnipeg. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks a lot. So, in my book, Constructing Ecoterrorism, I examine some absurd and rather alarming statements that have been made by government officials, police, media, and industry over the last decade or so. These statements have identified animal rights activists as eco-terrorists, and have compared the animal rights movement to groups like Al-Qaeda, and have even identified animal rights activists as the #1 domestic terrorism threat in the US. Well, what do we mean by terrorism? There are 100 definitions, but when North Americans think of terrorism, they likely think of the 9/11 attacks that hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, or the killings in 2015 in Paris, or the terrible events that happened yesterday in Brussels. But let's remember that what most people in the world experience as terrorism is violence by the state, killing, torturing, intimidating hundreds of millions of people over the last century and beyond. Colonialism, genocide, death squads, so on. The 50,000 killed and 2 million displaced in South Sudan is only a recent example. Or some may think of what Noam Chomsky calls the worst terrorist campaign in the world by far, the US global assassination campaign using drones. Another major source of terrorism comes from elites, such as wealthy cattle ranchers in the Amazon, whose hired gunmen have killed hundreds of peasants, indigenous people, and environmentalists. And similarly, when we think of ecoterrorism, we might properly think of corporations that are involved in destructive practices of resource extraction, that regularly use violence against non-human animals, against the environment, and against people who oppose what they do, employing the police and the militaries of the states in which they operate, or their own private armies. And in terms of the global meat industry, it's not just in the Amazon that we see such violence. There's a long historical record of human and animal rights violations and injustices, as well as the pollution of air, soil, and water, massive biodiversity loss, the extinction of tens of thousands of species, the destruction of rainforests for the production of livestock or for growing food to feed these animals, pandemic diseases, antibiotic resistance, the bankrupting of our healthcare systems, and so on, as well as major contributions to climate change, with greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector surpassing that of the world transportation sector, leading to ecological disaster, the possible collapse of civilization, and unimaginable violence. However, the term terrorism or ecoterrorism is not typically used to describe that kind of violence. Rather, the term is applied to those who oppose it. Nevertheless, when most people think of terrorism, they do think of murderous violence directed at innocent civilians. So, it's an interesting question. How could such a term come to be applied to animal rights activists? After all, the overwhelming majority of activism is legal and nonviolent. Things like vegan potlucks, public lectures, literature tables, demonstrations, street marches, so on. The Animal Liberation Front guidelines explicitly prohibit any actions that are intended to harm humans or other animals, and no animal rights activists have ever set out to murder anyone, although many activists have been killed. And even in terms of illegal actions, this mainly consists of rescuing animals from situations in which they are to be harmed or killed, actions that we would normally consider noble and praiseworthy. Yes, there have been some incidents of property damage, although most of them are relatively minor. In rare cases, there have been small explosive devices that have been used, and in one incident in the UK in 2001, the director of Huntington Life Sciences, the biggest vivisection company in Europe, was assaulted. However, that assault was unreservedly condemned by the very same animal rights groups that were being characterized as terrorists. And it's not only that animal rights terrorism is exaggerated, but it occurs in a context in which very serious forms of actual political violence have been ignored. For example, we know from a 2013 study by the US Military Academy that right-wing extremists in the United States have averaged 337 attacks per year after 9/11, accounting for 254 fatalities. The same study indicates that since 9/11, there has been an average of 6 Islamist terror plots against US targets per year. Most of them have been disrupted, but the 20 that were carried out accounted for 54 fatalities. Nevertheless, since 2001 in North America, domestic terrorism concerns by government, police, industry, media, have focused on Muslims and on animal rights and environmentalists and environmental activists, going beyond absurd limits. Government and police have exaggerated threats, identifying animal rights activists as their top priority, while ignoring actual political violence from right-wing extremists, which is far more extensive and deadly. And indeed, there's abundant evidence that demonstrates that these right-wing groups are dangerous. Right-wing terrorists have planned or conducted the bombings of government buildings, banks, refineries, utilities, synagogues, mosques, memorials, bridges. They've planned or conducted assassinations of police officers, judges, politicians, civil rights figures, robberies of banks and armored cars, and they've amassed illegal machine guns, missiles, explosives, and biological and chemical weapons. And most of them have planned to kill large numbers of people, thousands. Right-wing extremists have repeatedly stated their intentions to kill as many people as possible. Nevertheless, despite such obvious dangers, government, police, and media have continued to focus on other targets. In numerous statements, FBI officials have identified animal and environmental activists as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. For example, 2008, FBI Special Agent Richard Colco was interviewed on media explaining that the FBI had 180 ongoing ecoterrorism investigations, but mentioned nothing about concern for right-wing terrorism. A 2014 Department of Homeland Security report did identify dangers from sovereign citizens, Islamist extremists, racist skinheads, militia patriot groups, and neo-Nazis. But nevertheless, it named animal rights activists and environmentalists as major threats, placing them above the KKK, anti-abortionists, extreme anti-tax groups, anti-immigrant groups, and the violent racist Christian identity movement. Although white supremacist groups engage in violence for ideological reasons, they are seldom characterized by media or charged as terrorists, and often police show little interest in their activities. For example, in 2008, James Powers, Director of Homeland Security in Pennsylvania, said that Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, who killed 168 and wounded 600 people, and abortion clinic bomber Eric Rudolph were not terrorists because they did not belong to a larger organization dedicated to overthrowing the government. Somehow overlooking McVeigh's clear association with anti-tax, militia, and white supremacy groups, Powers stated, "McVeigh is not a terrorist, just very angry with the US government. Whether a person is a terrorist or a criminal is irrelevant to me." Well, while Powers found such distinctions irrelevant, they are in fact highly political. And the terrorism label is used to demonize particular groups. As well, the distinction is highly relevant to those people who are charged, since terrorists are given much harsher sentences for the same actions that are committed by people categorized as criminals. Another example of the political usage of the term was provided last June, 2015, when white supremacist Dylan Roof killed 9 black people at a South Carolina church. Although Roof covered himself with apartheid symbols and had written a racist manifesto explaining his motivations, FBI Director James Comey did not consider this terrorism, saying, "Terrorism is an act of violence done or threatened in order to try and influence a public body or citizenry, so it's more of a political act. I don't see it as a political act." So while Comey declared that the murder of 9 black people by a white supremacist seeking to start a race war was not terrorism, did not constitute terrorism or a political act, less than 1 month later, the FBI clarified what did when it arrested 2 animal rights activists, Joseph Budenberg and Nicole Cassan, for releasing mink from a fur farm. Well, how can we explain this strange focus? I'd like to point to 2 broad institutional forces that have an effect in creating this menace. First, the animal rights movement threatens what Barbara Noska in 1997 identified as the animal industrial complex, a network of government, corporate, and scientific institutions operating across various industries based on the exploitation and commodification of non-human animals. The sociologist David Nibbert, who's written important studies on the political economy of animal exploitation, describes how ranchers, grain producers, factory farms, and slaughterhouses directly involved in the exploitation of non-human animals and integrated with fast food, retail, and advertising companies, coalesced with financial institutions, lobbyists, politicians, and government agencies to form an immense, powerful network promoting the increased consumption of other animals as food. Well, Nibbert was talking about the use of animals for food, but the animal industrial complex also includes other industries, medical, pharmaceutical, agrochemical, biotechnology, genetically modified foods, and so on. And we can also add hunting, entertainment, fashion, the pet keeping industry, and the global wildlife trade as part of this animal industrial complex. As well as operating lobby groups such as the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Chicken Farmers of Canada, Egg Farmers of Canada, and so on, industries collaborate and fund front groups such as the Center for Consumer Freedom, the National Animal Interest Alliance, and many, many others, supporting various issues, even those that do not concern them directly because they recognize a commonality of interests. Alarmed by activists' ethical, financial, and political challenges, and the public response to their revelations of the institutionalized violence in factory farms and slaughterhouses, and to the gigantic recalls of contaminated meat and the outbreaks of E. coli and salmonella poisoning, the animal industrial complex reacted with massive propaganda campaigns to convince people that what they do is acceptable and safe. The advertising expenditures of individual corporations are enormous. As well as advertising their specific products, corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars on PR campaigns defending the industrial agriculture system itself, which is based on factory farming and the extensive use of antibiotics and other drugs that are given to animals, herbicides, pesticides, additives, biotechnology, so on. Individual corporations and industry associations have spent billions on advertising, marketing, and PR. This includes training farmers and ranchers to deliver corporate messages, creating front groups, funding academics to provide useful reports, and attacking activists, journalists, and scientists. Industries and lobby groups contribute millions to political campaigns and parties, while corporate-funded front groups such as the American Legislative Exchange Council shape useful legislation like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and so-called ag-gag laws that make it a crime to expose what happens in factory farms and slaughterhouses. So the animal industrial complex recognizes animal rights activists as a threat to their interests, and it's dedicated to undermining them through propaganda, delegitimization, and efforts to weaken them financially. For example, the National Animal Interest Alliance claims tax-exempt animal rights organizations like PETA endorse violence and fund terrorism, and it demands the removal of their tax-exempt status. So that's one institutional force that is involved in the creation of ecoterrorism. There is a second institutional force. Understanding anxieties about animal rights terrorism and ecoterrorism requires our consideration of a broader context, not only of the direct financial interests of the animal industrial complex, but also of an explosion of interest in terrorism generally, and the development of what we can call terrorism entrepreneurs, people whose careers and livelihoods are based on studying and counteracting terrorism and who operate within a network of institutions. Edward Herman and Jerry O'Sullivan in 1989 identified the network of government and private institutions and experts as what they called the terrorism industry. They described an Orwellian process in which terrorism was constructed to meet the needs of Western state policy. In this system, government and corporate elites supported institutions and think tanks that produced a coterie of intellectuals and experts who created appropriate messages for transmission by a compliant and unquestioning mass media, creating a steady stream of right-wing propaganda in which alternative views, when they appeared at all, would appear to be incomprehensible and outrageous. The production of appropriate messages not only generated support for particular counterinsurgency operations, but created a sense of general fear and irrationality, giving political elites the freedom to advance their agenda and justifying repressive legislation, increased surveillance, infringement on individual rights, and a buildup of military force. The 9/11 attacks provided opportunities to expand this terrorism industry, and similar opportunities arose in Paris after the November 2015 attacks. There was a ban of public protest at the UN Climate Summit and house arrest for many activists. After 9/11, not only was there an intensification of government intelligence operations, but the rapid proliferation of research institutes, think tanks, and academic interest in the study of terrorism. Well, those whose careers are invested in studying terrorism need terrorists to study. Thus, there's a tendency to include growing numbers of individuals, groups, and social movements under this term, even when the fit is not a good one, as is the case with animal rights activists. And the proliferation of forms of terrorism provides opportunities for research, publication, and career advancement, So terrorism is a profit-generating opportunity. Indeed, after 9/11, an array of corporations, lawyers, politicians, charities, security firms, merchandisers, lawyers, and fraudsters enjoyed lucrative profits, taking advantage of this climate of fear, calls for revenge, and militarism. For example, Michael Chertoff, Homeland Security Secretary 2005 to 2009, started his own private security firm, and he used his official media interviews to promote the installation of full-body scanners at airports without revealing the fact that his firm represented the manufacturer. But of course, these takings were small compared to the enormous profits, the billions of dollars that were generated by the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and that were reaped by oil and gas companies, weapons contractors, construction firms, electronics, and intelligence operations. Well, this terrorism industry has grown extensively since 2001. For example, in 2010, the Washington Post described a defense and intelligence bureaucracy so large, so unwieldy, and so secretive that no one knows how much money it costs, how many people it employs, or whether it is making the United States safer. The Post found nearly 1,300 government organizations and nearly 2,000 private companies engaged in top-secret counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence operations, operating in 10,000 locations across the U.S. and accounting for the construction of 33 new building complexes in Washington, D.C. alone, with 850,000 personnel with top secret security clearance working in these agencies. But thousands of other jobs are associated with them through construction, technology, provision of services, and so on. So clearly, enormous amounts of money are involved here. And the rapid growth of these operations should be seen in the context of the massive expansion and militarization of policing in general, along with growing incarceration rates and for-profit prisons. Like private security and intelligence firms, state police have an interest in identifying various menaces, all of which necessitate their increased budgets, as exaggerated dangers are used to justify the acquisition of more powerful weapons and surveillance technology. In Canada, police have not only acquired high-powered weapons and armored military vehicles, but they coordinate their activities with the military. For example, Vancouver Police Department has a military liaison unit, which also receives training from the U.S. National Guard. So the idea that ecoterrorism is a serious danger is a social and a political construction, which has been developed to protect the animal industrial complex from its critics. By naming individuals or groups as terrorists, industries have pursued particular social and political objectives: to discredit their critics, to present them as not only wrong, but fundamentally malevolent. For those whose interests are threatened by dissident groups, it's efficacious if criticism can not only be undermined and dismissed, but if it can be presented as the depraved rantings of monstrous evildoers. And thus, activists' efforts to protect animals were consistently compared to mass murder by Islamist terrorists, as those who profited from animal exploitation presented themselves as helpless victims. They deliberately manipulated feelings of fear and vengeance created by 9/11 as a device that allowed them to demand repression of their critics. Turning activists into terrorists not only served to protect those who profit directly from animal exploitation, the construction of ecoterrorism furthered the interests of a growing network of these terrorism entrepreneurs who market their abilities to collect useful intelligence about the animal rights movement and provide security against the threat that it poses to industry. Understanding that exaggerating a variety of threats can help their careers, these entrepreneurs are determined to sell the animal rights movement and ecoterrorism, along with other dangers, as formidable menaces that require their specialized intervention and protection. So, driven by the imperative of capitalist institutions to protect profits, the need of intelligence, security, and police organizations to legitimize their existence and expand their powers, public surveillance and political spying intensified, frequently directed at legal activities, and including innocuous ones, which are deemed subversive. For example, the ACLU in 2010 issued a report that described increased political spying in the US, much of it focused on anti-war activists, but also including such desperate criminals as the 4 activists in Beaverton, Oregon, who were arrested for using washable chalk to write "Save the Animals" on a public sidewalk as a protest of a planned construction of a new vivisection laboratory at the University of Washington. And other counterterrorism measures included California's Homeland Security Office spying on activists who were protesting Canada's seal hunt, the deployment of 6 undercover agents to infiltrate a lecture on veganism at the University of California in Fresno, Colorado University Boulder police intercepting email messages about Fur-Free Friday, which they then reported to the Denver police and to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which at the same time was busy spying on Food Not Bombs, a group that provides vegetarian food to homeless people. And at the University of Minnesota, the task force also attempted to recruit a student who'd been arrested for vandalism as an undercover agent who would then infiltrate vegan potluck dinners. So while these surveillance operations demonstrate that the police agencies involved are hard-pressed to find terrorists, it's also pretty clear that the targets are chosen with a definite ideological orientation. And just as the military requires constant production of new enemies to justify its existence and the continued inflow of public funds, the counterterrorism industry needs a steady supply of terrorists who can be identified as significant threats. If a shortage of Islamist terrorists exists, well, other dangers must suffice. And the animal rights movement provided a significant growth area for the industry. Private intelligence and security operations use these concepts to promote a climate of fear in order to sell their self-proclaimed expertise to corporations. And as I said, even more eager to depict animal activists as terrorists were corporations that were profiting directly from animal exploitation. Seeing their profits threatened by the animal rights movement, they spent millions on propaganda to discredit their critics, mobilizing to label activists as terrorists and to create laws that prevent interference in their operations. Thus, in the course of constructing ecoterrorism, the interests of these 2 forces, the intelligence and security corporations and the animal industrial complex, intersect. So, they intersect in the creation of animal rights terrorism, but the reason why their ridiculously exaggerated claims can be taken seriously is because animal rights does indeed constitute a kind of existential terror among many. This is because it challenges our deeply rooted ideologies of speciesism and human exceptionalism. We are convinced that other animals exist for us and that we can do whatever we want with them. Massive violence against non-human animals, killing billions upon billions of them every year, is not even recognized as violence or even as abuse or cruelty. The few animal protection laws that we do have are restricted to individual acts of sadism, not the standard industry practices that inflict such horrific violence on these animals. We have internalized the exploitation of other animals so that any challenge to this system is considered an affront to the essential rightness of our domination. And we're willing to accept the most outrageous hyperbole about animal rights terrorism as if it actually constituted some sort of serious discussion. Speciesism is the practice of assigning value to beings based solely on their membership in a particular species. Many consider it a prejudice, like racism or sexism, in that treatment is based on morally irrelevant differences. David Nibbert identifies speciesism as an ideology, shared ideas, values, and beliefs that legitimize a given social order, and as a key aspect of oppression, along with economic exploitation and unequal power. This materialist analysis of the entangled oppression of humans and other animals provides a historical context in which we can understand it, emphasizing and clarifying how oppression has intensified under capitalism. Under capitalism, alienation reaches its utmost form, with humans estranged from themselves, from other humans, from the products of their labor, and from other species and nature. Operating under a deformed consciousness, which enables extreme violence towards other animals and their fetishization as commodities. The commodification of non-human animals means they are treated not as individuals with inherent value, but as objects that only have exchange value based on their worth to others. For farmed animals, this is achieved by ignoring the quality of their lives, minimizing the costs, maximizing production, leading to all of the horrors of factory farming. The animal rights movement not only threatens these financial interests, it constitutes an ontological, existential threat to those whose identities are constructed through animal exploitation. These identities are gendered, as with manly hunters or cowboys, or through the association of masculinity with meat consumption. And these kinds of ideological mystifications allow us to remain unconcerned about the brutal violence that we inflict on individuals of other species. We do this without sympathy or empathy, ignoring their cries of anguish. Our alienation allows us to treat other beings as sources of food, labor, and entertainment, as objects of research, to treat them as slaves, and subject them to unthinkable extremes of savagery in factory farms and slaughterhouses, laboratories, and other sites of institutionalized barbarism. And to convince ourselves that their suffering either does not matter or it does not exist, and that we have the right to dominate them. While Marxism identified the industrial worker as the most exploited of commodities, we need to acknowledge what non-human animals experience at our hands and recognize them as what Daniel Sayers calls the most wretched of beings in the cage of capitalism. Non-human animals have been exploited, oppressed, and victimized throughout history backed by ideas of a sharp division between ourselves and other animals, and of our moral superiority. This has been legitimized by claims about supernatural permission for domination, the possession of a soul, rationality, language, tool use, emotions, or self-awareness. Yet the differences between humans and other animals are ones of degree, not of kind, as Darwin observed long ago. And we are not the only species that possess the characteristics that qualify us for ethical consideration. Other species share these, while the characteristics that may differentiate us from other animals are irrelevant in ethical terms. Nevertheless, mistaken notions of human exceptionalism allow us to fetishize animals as commodities for our use, and capitalism has intensified our oppression of other animals, creating this massive, globally destructive system. Activists, animal rights activists, face both the vast institutionalized power of the global animal industrial complex and the deeply rooted ideology of speciesism, which it incorporates and perpetuates. So to deconstruct the discourse of ecoterrorism is to engage in a paradigm shift and to challenge the exploitation of non-human animals. Building on ecofeminist insights, we can identify interlocking oppressions, understand the connections between the oppression of non-human animals and women, for example, and argue for ethical relations with other animals. As the African-American sociologist and feminist, former Black Panther Party member Angela Davis pointed out, animal rights and veganism are part of a revolutionary perspective. How we can not only discover more compassionate relations with humans, but how we can develop compassionate relations with the other creatures with whom we share this planet. And that would mean challenging the whole capitalist industrial form of food production. Well, speciesists and human exceptionalists argue that if we increase our compassion and respect for other animals, we will necessarily diminish this for other humans. They depict it as a zero-sum game, but that's not true. Some of you may have seen a study last month that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science demonstrating the effects of switching to a vegan diet. They found that this would save 8 million human lives. It would cut food-related greenhouse gas emissions by 70%. It would save $1 trillion in healthcare costs. So it's not a zero-sum game. You know, the effects are interrelated. And we might remember what Einstein advised us about this kind of separation from the rest of the world. He said, "A human being is a part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space." He said, "We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task," he concluded, "must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." So, the discourse of ecoterrorism fits into and feeds these kinds of binary separations that Einstein is talking about here. Animal rights activists have overcome this optical delusion of consciousness, and they offer us a key to the prison door. We should have the integrity and the courage to step through it, and the wisdom to reject the illusions that are created to deter us from doing so. Thanks.